September is Heritage Month, and many have used the opportunity to draw on the history of the country's diverse and rich traditional and cultural history. But apart from the odd stories passed on from generation to generation, the little that is taught of that history in our schools has not helped that many South Africans. So we want to know, how did the South African languages and cultures come about after all? Besides, most of the time we focus on the conflicts between groups of people, but we have never established how they got to be here in the first place and develop their cultures and how they relate to one another. Publisher of South African Heritage Publishers is Terence Bell. Is with us on the show to talk about how they created a series called Our Story that collects and retells with equal importance and emphasis the story of the ancestry of South Africa. Terence? Dumela ra.
Akher alega.
Re tsogile re tlotse. Ka itumela. Now, Terence, tell me, how was the series brought into being?
Well, I was in Vuwani with visiting a friend of mine, Konanani Mativa, who was Tshivenda speaking, or is Tshivenda speaking. And I had two old friends with me, Jimmy Justice Maluleke, a Vatsonga by extraction, and Ngobeni, who was obviously Amashangana. And they were asking me about the history of the first contact between their ancestors, those three groups of people, and the role that the Portuguese played in those first meetings. And I had just established that the original name for Vuwani was Lokati van Taban. And I asked them who Taban was, and they couldn't answer. And I decided to tease them by saying, it surprises me that people who are so respectful of the ancestors know so little about what those ancestors did. And Konanani Mativa said to me, Terence, you know you are right to scold us, but you know something about publishing, you know a little bit of all of our languages, a lot of our history, and you've worked very closely in our schools. Why don't you do something about it?
And that's how
so she issued that challenge at her house in Vuwani. And I went away and thought about what I wanted to do. I didn't want to publish history textbooks. That I knew at the start. And I started thinking about major events that had happened a long time ago, which still affect the structure of our society. And the greatest of these, in my opinion, is the Battle of Umhlatuzi River, which next year will be 200 years. It's 200th anniversary. And that was the great battle between the Mthethwa, led by Zwide Kalanga, and under him he had two junior chiefs, Shoshangan Kanqumalo and Zwangindaba Kajele. And he was fighting against Shaka, the famous, or the most famous of our military leaders and chiefs, I suppose. And under Shaka was Mzilikazi Kamashobane. Before they fell out with one another, they first fought together. Mzilikazi Kamashobane was fighting against his own grandfather. Zwide Kalanga was the grandfather of Mzilikazi Kamashobane. The Amandwandwe were defeated and had to flee. The three chiefs fled, and their people fled towards Mbombela. There they defeated Tulare, the grandfather of Sekukuni, and the Bapedi were pushed towards Burgersfort and up towards Bushbuck Ridge. And then, for reasons we don't know, Shoshangan Kanqumalo and Zwangindaba went into Mozambique, and so began the conquest of some of the Vatsonga tribes into the Amashangana Vatsonga that we know today.
Okay. Now, I'm just picking up from what Soshangane, right? Is probably then Shangan comes from his name, I suppose, after having taken over sections of Vatsonga cultural groups.
That's quite correct, yes.
In Mozambique at the time. Because, you see, Terence, for instance, let me just stay with that point for a second, that I did not know what the difference was between Vatsonga and Vashangan. So tell me more.
Okay, well, if you... once we did the battle of Umhlatuzi River, it was obvious that we should do a book on Shoshangan. We then did a book on his son, Muzila. He had two major sons, Mawewe and Muzila. And we did a book on Guguyane, who was the son of Muzila. Now, Shoshangan and his son and grandson conquered various clans of Vatsonga, I won't name them all, and began to meld them into what we call the Gaza Kingdom, what is known as the Gaza Kingdom, which stretched literally from Zimbabwe through Mozambique towards the Sabi River. And yes, that's how the Chitsonga nation the Chitsonga language that we know today evolved and developed. And that is why we have both Amashangana and Vatsongas living in the Limpopo area.
I'm jumping back to the series itself, the approach. I noticed that the stories are told about some of the most celebrated personalities in the histories of those specific people.
Yes, we have 21 published at the moment, which is frankly hardly scratching the surface. We've already identified another 70 stories that we would like to tell of people, of events. And again, that's hardly scratched the surface. There are so many stories that come to mind. If I can give you an example, a colleague of mine was contacted by Edinburgh University, who found a very old manuscript about the survivors of a ship that sunk off the Wild Coast in 1828, I think it was. And there were only 6 French survivors who were taken in, I think, by Amachakhabe. I'm not entirely sure. But they were held captive for 3 days. And on the 3rd day, the Frenchmen heard a furious argument in isiXhosa, and they heard a voice they hadn't heard before. And they peered out and they saw a colored man remonstrating in fluent isiXhosa. The colored man saw them peering out of the hut, and he ran across to them to inquire how they were, and he started speaking to them in Dutch. But they didn't understand Dutch because they were French.
Yes.
At any rate, the next day he returned and he took them back to his father's house. His father was a white Hollander called Lochenberg, who was married to a colored lady, a Hottentot in those days. And he so hated the British that when the British annexed the Cape, he decided to go and live in what we today call the Transkei. To cut an awfully long story short, the survivors make their way back to Cape Town, their story is written, and they then hear news that Lochenberg has been killed fighting against the Zulu. Now, I'm still doing research on this. I don't think it was the Zulu, it was Matawanes and Gwani who had been displaced from KwaZulu-Natal. But isn't it extraordinary that a white man died fighting side by side with his black brothers in 1829, 1830.
But here's another point that, there's generally the different cultural groups, the African cultural groups in South Africa have a common sense of belonging to South Africa itself, but at the same time have the sense of being different from one another. So what is the connection between the different groups, right? Broadly speaking, we hear of the Nguni groups and the Sotho groups, if you can break them down for me, and then reconnect them, that how do they relate to one another?
Please understand, I'm not a language specialist, but as I know it, if you study African languages, you begin to study a language called Urbantu, which is apparently the original African language. You will know that all of our languages have certain words that are very common, Vatu, Bantu, Batu, etc. And there was clearly a split, who knows how many years ago. But it's generally held that the Setswana, Sesotho speaking peoples came down on their migration through the west of the country, through what we now know as Botswana, whereas the Abanguni clans came down through Mozambique and into northern KwaZulu-Natal.
When you say coming down from where?
Coming down from Central Africa, it's
Okay,
held that,
come from the Great Lakes.
Exactly. Abanguni arose east of the Great Lakes. Vavenda and Sesotho came from west of the Great Lakes.
Yeah. And then they all settled here in South Africa. But now you have Amaxhosa, Zulu-speaking people, Shangaan, Swati, all seen as the Nguni group.
Correct. Today. Yes.
And then you've got Bapedi, Batswana, Basotho.
Correct.
What's the difference?
Well, the difference obviously lies in the language, as you know. And what I found quite interesting is reading about the Abanguni prior to Shaka. There were very many different clans, the Kwabes, the Kumalos. I won't go through it, but there were a lot of different clans. And of course, the two major clans were the Mtetwa and the Ndwandwe. Once the Mtetwa were defeated, Shaka found it much easier to consolidate those clans into the Amazulu that we know today.
Sure.
Now, the only comparable example I can think of in the Sotho groupings is Moshweshwe, who brought together different clans of Setswana-speaking people, Sesotho-speaking people, different clans of the Griquas, etc., who joined him around Thaba Bosiu, and he forged the Sotho nation from those different clans. Whereas I think that the Setswana have more or less maintained their clanship, if you like. They've never had a king that has ruled over all of them. That's how I understand it.
And I was going through the book of Sekhukhune. How does he become an influential figure then?
Well, obviously, he lived during a very turbulent time. His people endured attacks from the Amandebele when Mzlikazi had a kraal in Middelburg. Mzlikazi then left and traveled to Pretoria North, where he ruled the whole of the old Transvaal as we knew it. In fact, he had a big kraal in Rustenburg. But the Bapedi had difficulty, obviously, with the Boers, and then when the British annexed the Transvaal Republic, with the British as well. So he was fighting military battles on a number of fronts, and I think that made him a very, very interesting man, and hence the story on Sekhukhune.
All right, we intend to tell the different stories, so at a certain time consolidate them, but it's a series of books on different influential figures who have led to the creation of the groups in some form, and others merely influence the fortunes or misfortunes of their people. Terence, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I much appreciate it.
Much appreciated.
Thank you. All the best.
Well, if you want to know more about this series of books and you want to understand who you are, you better grab yourself a copy of one of them. It's called Our Story, and Terence Bell is the publisher thereof.